So if you are starting with us, this is your first time or maybe your second time, we have been using this Lenten season to journey through what is called the Enneagram. We've called it the sacred journey. Perhaps the greatest journey you could ever do is the journey inward, to better understand who you are, to become more self-aware. If you're not familiar with Lent, it's the 40 days leading up to Easter, minus the Sundays. And it also, Christians use this season to reflect the 40 days Jesus spent in the wilderness, praying, fasting, enduring temptation, really, I think, uncovering who he was and what his calling was to do. So sometimes what I like about the Christian seasons, and especially Lent, which is actually my favorite Christian season, is there's times to disconnect from the world. And so often we're so connected, we have so many things going on, that it can be helpful to use a season to sort of disconnect and spend time really in prayer, fasting, self-examination, looking within ourselves. What's going on in my life? What's priority in my life? What's happening? So we're using that, the Enneagram as a tool for that. On the next slide, if you're not familiar with the Enneagram, this is just a basic symbol. If it's the first time, it sounds awkward, Enneagram, and it looks kind of like a pentagram, so you might be thrown off a little bit. But I assure you, Christians have been using this for hundreds of years, and it's actually going around in a lot of churches who are using, in our small group, we're using this book, The Road Back to You, written by a pastor and a pastor's wife, actually. And so people are finding it very, very useful. Here's a couple things to note. There's 9 different types, but actually you have all the types within you. So you start there. But what happens is we tend to gravitate early on in life towards one type, primarily. We gravitate towards that type as a way to cope, sometimes with pain, suffering, struggle, conflict, whatever it is. And so the Enneagram is meant to be a tool to allow you to see, oh, I tend to box myself in this type and act this way. And here's some tools to help you move out of that box. Does that make sense? Kind of move back to the center. Some people talk about the circle as just the face or the image of God that holds all of these together equally. So we're learning about different types. We've done 8, 9, 1, 2, 3. Today we're going to do 4 and 5. I want to invite you at this time, if you have not taken a test, if you don't know your Enneagram type, to go ahead and pull out your smartphone. If you can go ahead and do that now. Yes, the pastor just said you can look at your smartphone in church. So I trust you will be doing it for this test. I'm going to give you a link here in a moment. But first, I wanted to say a couple quick things, and I've said before. The Enneagram is an ancient tool for spiritual formation. Recently, people have added this sort of test to try to get to the point quicker. Give me my type. Now, that can be helpful, but it can also be confusing because it tests for your motivations, which is hard to test for, and find your type. So it's a good place to start, but it's not near 100% accurate. So I'll give you a link, but don't trust it completely. It might, if you test for it, it'll probably resonate to some extent, but hold it up as we go through the rest of the types too. And could I be something else? And look at all of those other aspects. Are you with me? So if you have your smartphone, if you have Facebook, go on Facebook, look up One Church. You could probably, the best way, One Church Chandler or One Church Arizona. Find us on Facebook, like us on Facebook. Shameless plug there. Like us on Facebook. And then on any of the recent posts, there's a link. You can just go down and you'll find, and that'll take you. If you do not have Facebook, or you'd rather, just Google Enneagram test with Road Back to You, or the Road Back to You Enneagram test, and it'll take you to the same link. So you can do that through the service. It won't take more than about 10 minutes. So we'll allow you to do that here. Look at your smartphone while I'm speaking, and no judgment, all right? I extend that to you. And as you do that, by introduction to Type 4, I want to invite you to go ahead and watch the short video together.
So the Enneagram Type 4, known as the romantic or the individualist. The quote for the Enneagram Type 4 would be, "I'm the only one who feels this way, and no one else can really understand." They tend to be into the dramatic parts of life, the highs the really high highs and the really low lows. Fours will dress very like artsy a lot of times. They'll have like very into style. They'll be into fashion like a 3, but maybe not as mainstream as a 3. They'll have like their own individual identity, and they may even craft stuff themselves because they want to be an innovator. They want to be somebody who sets the trend. They want to stand out and be original. They want to be a carbon copy of anyone else. And so that's kind of, I think, the energy of why they feel that no one can understand them, because they're so into their own experience of life, which is good. And so existentially or experientially, they feel life in the highs and the lows, and they're a part of the emotion center along with the 3 and the 2. An example of a type 4 song would be Pink, Just Give Me a Reason. And Pink actually strikes me as a very 4-ish type of artist as well. I feel like Shakespeare is probably 4-ish too, getting to the dramatic part of to be or not to be, that is the question. It's kind of a stereotype, but 4s tend to be on the artistic side of things. Famous 4s are like Edgar Allan Poe, Johnny Depp, Steve Jobs. I mean, I love all those 3.
I like 4s. I'm not a type 4. I'm actually a type 9, as I said a few weeks ago. But I am married to a type 4. So I get to air out all the 4's dirty laundry today. Not at all. I like a warm bed at night, so that won't happen. But a couple things. Many of the Enneagram teachers believe that the 4 is the most complex Enneagram type. What you see is never what you get. And that's not because they hide it, because they're driven really by authenticity, but because there's so many layers going on, and they experience these layers more than the rest of us. We might experience some of that at times, but they experience more emotions and feelings than any other type. And also, they think it's probably the most rarest of the Enneagram types, which also plays a part into the 4 probably feels the most misunderstood and the most kind of odd and disconnected from everybody else. So that might explain some of that. If you're a type 4, you just know you're also probably the rarest type, which might also contribute to you feeling misunderstood at times and feeling a little bit like an outcast. Some of the titles for the type 4 is the romantic and the individualist, their core motivation. And I'd kind of try to cover it, but also concise in 3 different ways. Their core motivation of those 4s is to be true to themselves, to be understood, and to feel significant. And all 3, I think, are important. And if you're a 4, you might resonate with one more than the other. But your motivation is the core driving force of what you do, to be true to who you are, to feel understood. They have a deep need and desire for deep connection with other people. 4s really struggle with any sort of surface language, any shallow talk, right? They want to go deep, and they want to go deep quickly. And they also want to feel significant. In the next slide, some ways to describe the 4. They tend to be sensitive, deep, empathetic, creative, intuitive, romantic, idealistic, probably the most introspective of all types, passionate, and authentic. Can sometimes be. This is when they're in their unhealth or when they're struggling with something in their life. They can be dramatic, self-absorbed, or temperamental. Some of the greatest poets and actors and musicians have been 4s. Michael Jackson, Prince, 2 great 4 musicians right there, which kind of reflects this whole, I have experienced this whole wealth of emotions and feelings, and now I'm going to create this other experience and connect with other people. Does that make sense? Hopefully with us. Rumi, the Sufi poet, was most likely a 4. Bob Dylan, most likely a 4. One of my favorite Christian authors, Thomas Merton, most likely a 4. Tim Burton, probably a 4. So this week I've used, okay, how can I get into the 4's mind as best as I can? So anybody ever watched the movie Edward Scissorhands? Yeah? A classic 4 movie. And so I remember watching this as a child, and it freaked me out. I actually remember vivid nightmares, so I had to overcome that. I'm like, I'm a grown adult. You can handle it, Aaron. So I sat down and I watched Edward Scissorhands. Not near as scary as I thought it was. I just remember a couple times where he was dark and he came out with the scissors, and I'm like, oh. So I watched that. By the way, as Anthony said, Johnny Depp is probably a 4. So here you have, written by a 4, an actor who's a 4, playing a very 4-type character. And Edward Scissorhands, he was created differently than everyone else. Obviously, scissors for hands, which made him really special and unique. If you remember the movie at all, he was able to design all these trees and shrubs and the dinosaurs and everything else, and cut people's hair and trim their dogs, and people loved him. He became famous. But at the same time, he couldn't connect in the same ways other people could connect. And if you look closely, one of the things, and this is not necessarily true of all 4s, but there can be this feeling like people close to me, it's hard to get so close because there's that pain. And every time he got close, somebody got hurt because his hands, of course, weren't there. So that's a classic 4. So I'm in the groove now. I'm feeling the 4 feeling as best as I can. By the way, one quote that I think reflects just what I said from a book called The Wisdom of the Enneagram. And they wrote, more than any other type, 4s are acutely aware of and focused on their personal deficiencies and differences, which I think is really interesting to note. We all feel that way from time to time, right? We all feel different or deficient in some way. 4s feel this probably more common and more throughout their lives than any other type of person. And this is a part of the reason. Their virtue and their vice. Their virtue, where they go in health, when they're healthy, they have this sort of equanimity, this peace in the midst of the flood of feelings. Some 4 described it as this way. If you're walking in an ocean, right, and you're walking a line, you have the waves that come. Those are the feelings, but you're still standing in the sand, so they don't carry you. But 4s can get pulled out far enough that now the ocean and their feelings, it's the waves will carry them to and fro, and they don't have that solid ground. But in health, it has that sort of equanimity to them. Their vice, sometimes called their sin, which we all struggle with envy, do we not? Yes, we do. I do. 4s have this underlying throughout much of their life. This is probably where the greatest work comes if you're a 4. Is figuring out, where is this in my life? How does this show up in my life? Because it will show up in different ways. No 2 4s will be exactly the same. We're all unique, right? But where does it show up if you are a 4 in your life? So I've heard from some 4s, and listen, it shows up in areas they don't want to be you, first of all. They want to be them, true, authentic, who they are. Thomas Merton, the 4, he kind of coined the phrase, that true self, right? Who am I? I want to be me. At the same time, they'll see maybe a colleague, and they'll say, they're super successful in this area. And that will stand out to them, and they'll envy that success. They don't want to be that person, but there's part of them they like. In other ways, it might be a social ease. 4s can sometimes feel a little awkward in social situations, which is weird because they connect with people naturally, but they can feel that at first, right? Edward Scissorhands, right? Something's odd about me. But they can feel that and kind of envy the social ease that other people might have. Or it might be, if you're a parent, you just envy what other parents can do, and they just, wow, they have it all together. I wish I had that all together. So some of the work, by the way, the attention of the 4 goes to what is missing in their lives. So there is this longing they have for things, because their attention is what is missing, what is there, which I think in spirituality, when it comes to God, can push them in great ways, to always long for more, to never be okay with the status quo. Richard Rohr talks about it in a book he wrote on the Enneagram, that many 4s throughout history kind of got pushed out or martyred or pushed on the sides because they weren't okay with how things were. They weren't okay with the carbon copy type things. They were always questioning, always longing for more. And what is missing? Yes, they're always looking at that. In Scripture, one of my favorite, actually, book of the Bible is Job. Job, in his story, is an archetypal example of a 4. The whole book, except for the very beginning, the prologue, but the whole book is written in poetry, first of all. And poetry just grasps the four's attention. They love that deep, and Job, by the way, is a very angsty book. He's wrestling with all kinds of stuff, which is a very fourish thing. And so if you're not familiar with it, I want to introduce, and it's helpful for us to all be reminded of this. Let's go ahead and read the first few verses in the chapter to find out what happened in Job's life. This is the wrong... No, that's the right one. Sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. One day, when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing, the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell on them, carried them off, and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. But I alone have escaped to tell you." Next slide. While he was still speaking, another came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 columns, made a raid on the camels, and carried them off, and killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and suddenly a great wind came across the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house, fell on the young people, and they are dead. I alone have escaped to tell you." So have you ever felt like you had a bad day? You know that phrase, when it rains, it pours, right? You know that we've probably all had those times where you're struggling with something. Maybe it's something at work and you're just really, it's frustrating. And then something else happens in a relationship and you're like, okay, of course, I got to deal with this now. And then you're driving to work frustrated because you're like, this has to get done, whatever, and your car breaks down. And you're like, okay, great, on top of that. And then you take another ride and you get called and your hot water heater breaks down. And like, by the way, it's $1,000 and you have all of these things going on, right? We all know the feeling. It's weird how that tends to happen in our lives. So this is the story of Job. So we jump in here. Job loses everything. By the way, interestingly enough, it's kind of like a aside, but Job, like the flood story, was taken from other ancient stories. And so the Hebrew people kind of adapted this story. And what is most interesting is Job confronts this idea of a very transactional universe. If you do good, you'll get good things. If you do bad, you'll get pain and suffering. And that was standard at that time. And we see this in parts, actually, of Scripture. Job is confronting those parts. It's giving a different perspective of those things. Because Job, we know, did nothing wrong. And by the way, the prologue, that narrative that I said in the beginning, it's a little odd because you have God over here and then you have not Satan, but the accuser, and they're kind of wagering over Job's righteousness. That was probably added to the story later on. Most of it is this poetic nature. And we even see that. I alone have escaped to tell you. It's this poetic nature there. And so in Job, it's confronting this transactional view. This, by the way, is still alive and well in our lives, in our world, in the church. And I would say we all kind of like that. We're all sort of attracted to that to some extent because it makes things simple. It makes things understandable. And it comes across as if you give money to the church, then you will be blessed financially. If you do this, pray this, do this, then you'll be blessed with health. And it's a very transactional way. It makes things simple. It makes us be able to understand things. But then we have this guy over here who lived completely righteous, and yet everything fell apart. So what happens? Job's wife says, "Why don't you just curse God and die?" So you lose everything, and then your wife says, "Why don't you just die?" Okay, that's a bummer. His 3 closest friends come to him, and the whole book, they argue and say, "Man, you must have done something wrong." And Job is getting all of these feelings and emotions, and I don't know, no, I didn't do anything wrong. And his friends are like, "You must have, it's clear. If you're experiencing suffering and pain, God's judging you for something." And Job's like, "I don't feel like I did." And then he begins to say, "I can't listen to you guys anymore," and kind of takes some of that out a little bit on God. God, where are you in the midst of this? What is happening? And this is interesting. The last 3 chapters, God comes onto the scene. And out of a whirlwind, it says. So out of the chaos of everything else. And this won't be up on the screen, but I'll start reading the first part. By the way, this is called a theophany. It's a God's speech, again, in the same poetry that's been used throughout. So the author is continuing this. So God says this, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man, and I will question you, and you shall declare to me." So we see this almost confrontation. And then God continues, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determines its measurements? Surely you know, Job. Or who stretched the line upon it? Or what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? And when the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy." And this is 3 chapters long, where God, gird up your loins. You almost get this feeling like they're in a boxing match. And it feels a little bit when you start like Job is actually beaten down on the ground and God's just, bam, kicking the crap out of him. And you get that feeling. But what's interesting is when you dive into this story, what is really happening is Job is in his own individualistic consciousness, self-absorbed with everything that's going on, which, to be honest, I have an enormous amount of sympathy for. If it happened to me, I would be right there. So you have this, I don't know, I don't understand. He's getting counsel, and God shows up and just says, there is a higher cosmic consciousness, things going on that you cannot see, that you were not a part of before, and you will not be a part of after. So there is sort of this comforting and discomforting about that, because Job never receives a reason why. Nothing, which is discomforting. Why does this pain, why is this going on? He never receives a reason why. He somehow just moves from that individualistic consciousness to say, okay, there's something else going on that I don't fully understand here. And I can trust that somehow, in some way, God is working through this. And I think that's, by the way, should be our reaction to other people when they go through pain and suffering. May we not be like his friends and say, what did you do wrong? May we be able to sit in the midst of people's pain and suffering and be there for them and walk through those times with them. So we see this sort of angsty book of pain and suffering and, struggling with your emotions. So what does it look like for a 4 to move to health or stress? On the next slide, we see when a 4 is healthy, they begin to take on characteristics of the type 1, which means they're able to move outside of themselves a little bit more, be more self-disciplined, get in touch with all their intuition and their creativity, and do something with that. But under stress, the type 4 will go towards the 2, and there's a little bit more, the negative side of the 2. There's a little bit more of, I need to be affirmed. I need somebody to tell me that it's going to be okay. So I have a friend who is a type 4, and I put together a little video. So he shows his own experience of what it's like to be a type 4 and reflecting on what it looks like for him when he moves to health and unhealth. So let's go ahead and watch that together.
Hi, I'm Scott, and I am a 4 on the Enneagram. It's taken me a while to figure out my type. For a while I thought I might be a 5. For even longer I thought I might be a 1, but I think I finally settled on 4. And I kind of wonder if part of it might be that we 4s want to be unique, so we don't want to be defined by just one type on the Enneagram. So what's it like to be a 4? 2 stories that I think illustrate that. The first is, a few months ago, my wife and I were in a marriage class, and it was a group of couples, and the conversations got very real, raw, authentic. People were revealing their real challenges and just the real stuff. And I looked forward to it every week. My wife, who is a 9 on the Enneagram, would, I think, rather have plucked her own eyes out with a fork than gone to that class and revealed that kind of emotional baggage. Story number 2, I went to a gathering of the Liturgists, which is a podcast, and everyone there was up for deep spiritual conversations. So 4s, we don't like small talk. We like to get immediately to the heart of things. And that was an environment where you could just simply say to someone, hi, I'm Scott. Do you even believe in God anymore? So it was great. In health, when things are going well, 4s move towards the healthy side of 1. So for me, what that looks like is being able to take my emotions, which normally push me around, and say, you know what, I'm going to learn from them. I'm going to learn what they have to teach me, but they're not going to make the decisions. So I'm going to drive, and they can sit in the back seat. And in unhealth and stress, 4s tend to move towards the unhealthy side of 2. So for me, that means needing a lot of validation from people. I find myself scheduling a lot more times with friends, reaching out to people a lot more to get that external validation.
So hopefully that helps give you guys a little bit better of an understanding of what it is from at least one type 4. Again, if you're a type 4, you won't resonate with everything, but it gives us a perspective of that. What 4s do well? 4s are probably the most empathetic of all types because they experience the full range of all of the emotions, and they're not afraid of it to explore those people. So if you want someone to sit with you in the midst of that pain and that struggle, 4s do this extremely well. They tend to be creative. They're extremely authentic. They're not going to pretend. What you will, I was almost going to say what you see is what you get, but then I just contradicted what I said before. So you'll get their authenticity. They combine creativity with ambition. 4s, they're right next to that 3. 3s are extremely ambitious and can get a lot of stuff done. 4s can do that too, but they do it differently, and they want to bring out their creativity and their own individual touch to that thing. They have the ability to find transcendence and sacredness in the midst of the pain and the darkness. They find that beauty that's hidden there that other types and other personalities like, oh, I don't want to even deal with that. They're like, oh, but there's something here that can be so beautiful and can be so connecting to us. So spiritual growth for 4s, some tips. Probably the single most important thing that I've read and can understand would be to develop a gratitude practice of some sort for a 4. That could be meditation, that could be journaling. You can write down prayers of things you're thankful for in the here and now. A meditation, what am I thankful for here? Because again, what the attention goes towards for a 4 is what is missing, which spiritually can be, like I said, beautiful. But in life, that can be really hard because there's always something else, right? So can you find contentment and fulfillment in the here and now? Solitude, 4s, like anybody else, need solitude, but 4s need more solitude probably more than any other type, or they tend to feel dry. They need to get in touch with what's going on internally. Journaling, therapy, spiritual direction. Good for any one of us, right? For 4s, that is because within themselves, they can get lost. It's like their emotions can get in knots and within themselves. And so what journaling, it might just be a simple journaling or therapy or spiritual direction can do is untangle those things because there's something within them. They know something's going on, but they can get lost within all of that. How do we get that out of them? Connecting with close friends. This was somebody who mentioned this because 4s crave connection so deeply. And because they can feel like a lot of connections are kind of surfacey, how do I create deep connection with somebody who I know and can be everything to them and go deep? A weekly or monthly service projects. This is because it gets them out of themselves. When my wife, she's a naturopathic medical student, and she said I could share this, by the way, so I'm not in the doghouse. When she goes down to Mexico and serves, she comes back after like an all-day Saturday thing where I would be exhausted, and she's just so full and loves that. It's this idea, I have something special to offer, and I'm moving outside of myself and offering this sort of creative gift to other people. So how can you implement that on a regular basis? Getting outside of those things at times, a touch point with other people. Find a creative outlet. If you're a 4, you are creative in some way. Now that might not look like an artist. It might look like something else. But what does that mean for you? How can you get in touch with that? And then another friend of mine mentioned meditation, centering prayer. That comes back to the emotions, right? And how do I find that equanimity? And one of the ways that 4s have found that is is meditation or centering prayer, which just kind of allows those emotions to slow down a little bit. So at this point in time, in a few moments, we're going to transition to type 5. and there's a short video that we're going to share in type 5. But I would like to invite you, somebody gave me these prayers for each Enneagram type. So I'd like to invite you, if you would, to close your eyes as we say the prayer for the Enneagram type 4, and I hope that if you're a type 4, that something about this resonates. And if you're not, I still hope something about this prayer resonates. God, thank you for seeking me, for never stopping to seek me. Open me to the intimate connection between us, that I may rest in your grace. Empty me of my shame and self-rejection, and soften my comparing mind and my longing, that I may know gratitude for what I have and for who I am. Guide me in the path of appreciation for the beauty and possibility that surrounds me, that is within me. Sacred source of my life, ground me in my inner calm and remind me of the holy and the beautiful in the ordinary. Open my eyes and my heart to see your grace-filled touch in all of life. And from this seeing, I know there really is no ordinary moments, for all is sacred. Amen.
All right, so the Enneagram Type 5, which is called the investigator or the intellectual, I believe, is their quote would be, "I'll keep a low profile so you can't intrude or control me." These types typically are very reserved. Often they'll sit in the back of the room and they'll observe everybody else. They want to take in as much as they can as far as information and knowledge. They're very much about being informed. They don't like to have their space intruded on, as the quote would say. They like to separate and distinguish between themselves and other people. Being in the head triad are more thinking types, and the way that they learn, the way they accumulate knowledge is much in the head and not so much in the experience, in the body, or in the feelings. In fact, the fives have the virtue of detachment, where they can actually detach how they feel about something and just analyze it like as an outsider observing. The speaking style for a type 5 would be like the verbal essay or dissertation. They will give you a rundown of all the details and give you all the information. In fact, you might have information overload. Type 5s will often want to gather the information so that they can have a grand theory of everything. They're able to aggregate people into groups or aggregate disparate subjects into a grand theory. An example of an Enneagram Type 5 song would be How by John Lennon. A great Type 5 would be Albert Einstein. Other famous Type 5s would be like Bill Gates, Stephen Hawking, or even Mark Zuckerberg. These are more your analytical people. Type 5s don't like the unknown. They like to know everything. They like to actually achieve essentially omniscience, if possible, to know everything there is to know.
All right, so how many 5s do we have in the room? We got a couple. I do see almost all of you are back there, except for you, Jackie. I'm shocked to see you in the front. I will try not to pick on you. Oh, I am probably the least likely candidate to be speaking about a 5. The most studying that I have done, we are almost polar opposites, which is good, which is great. Here's the other thing you'll learn about the Enneagram is we need each other. If everything was ruled in the feeling triad, it would be a disastrous mess. It would just be, oh. We need people that are centered in their head and centered in their body. So we're switching, obviously, from the heart triad or the feeling center, as Aaron talked about, the 4. I can relate to so much of the 4, and so many people have said, I bet you're a 4. But so for some of you that might be confused because some of the types overlap, really hone in on the motivation part. The part of the motivation I don't resound with 4, and this is what has clued me in to say I really am a 2, but there's a lot with the 4s. Matter of fact, when we were filming the video, Anthony kept laughing and saying, you look like a 4. You're actually like a 4. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm not. So there might be some things that you go, I really resound with these types, and that's because we are all types, we just have more than others. So we're switching this, going from the heart triad to now, which is the head triad, or the thinking center, which is comprised of 5, 6, and 7. The thing that's interesting about this center is it's all rooted in fear. And each center that we'll probably dive into a little bit more has an undergirding thing that we're dealing with. And so 2, 3s, and 4s might be shame. The thinking center is fear. And the way they all deal with and face this fear is vastly different. If I got 5, 6, and 7s and had them all talk about this, they would look like they would be very completely different people. The other thing that's interesting is now we're making this jump from this feeling to thinking, but on the Enneagram, and I designed this thing, so I made it, I can't help it, I'm a little OCD, I made it perfect. 5 and 4 actually should be further apart on the Enneagram. Those numbers are actually further apart, and it's on purpose. It's actually quite intentional, because they're trying to prove a point that actually making a jump from thinking to feeling or feeling to thinking is actually hard. It's actually one of the hardest jumps to make because they operate so differently. And that's not to leave the instinctive or body center out either. You guys are absolutely important. But this connection is really challenging. And so that's quite intentional. And so we'll start by exploring, since we're jumping into the center, we'll start by exploring the type 5. And although, like I said, I'm not a type 5 myself, ask any type 5 and they probably don't want to get up here and talk about themselves. That's the general consensus of most 5s I know. They're like, I'll just hang back, you talk about it. Type 5s are known as the investigator, the observer, the specialist, the thinker, and also the observer. And the thing with them is they need to know. They need to know. I mean, it's like an insatiable need to know, and we'll dive in maybe more why. Sorry, I'm going to try to get rid of that annoying sound. 5s tend to be the most cerebral types. They're really lost in thought. They're lost in observation and processing. They'll often enjoy their own company and books, learning, and I literally wrote this down, fantasy games, and I heard that you guys just played Dungeons & Dragons the other day. Bingo, type 5. Type 5. It's great. It engages the mind. It really engages the mind. This might be the type who is prone to read the dictionary. Literally, you might. You might call it fun. 5s are typically more introverted. That doesn't mean they're antisocial. This is such a differentiating thing. It does not mean they don't like people, but they might be a little bit more introverted because they feel that their energy levels get depleted faster than others. They might keep to the back of the room where it's safe, as I mentioned before, but when a 5 does, here's the thing you can count on. When a 5 does spend time with you, especially if you're a close friend, consider this a gift because they've actively chosen you as a friend. They've actively chosen to spend time with you and their energy, which is precious and limited. So the gift they offer in that area is really being present and being sincere. They're really being authentic with themselves versus some of us are prone to kind of schmooze and, hey, how's it going? And a 5 is I have very limited amounts of energy and who I spend it with is important to me. So 5s at their best, let's start there. They're cerebral, perceptive, innovative, pragmatic, respectful, and mindful. And I do agree, they offer so much of this. A lot of times 5s are at the forefront of innovation. They are the ones creating, so it's a different type of creativity. That's why I love that 4s and 5s are right next to each other. The 4 is the typical creativity, as most people think artsy. The 5 starts to get into this problem-solving, innovative creativity. So 5s at their worst, which nobody likes to talk about their worst. I had to already, so now it's your turn, 5s. 5s can become isolated. They can get stingy, overly intellectual, nihilistic, detached, and disconnected. This, for some people, they may go, I have experienced all of those. For some, you might, just like any other type, pinpoint on a few different things. The isolation part, though, we'll dive into the isolation and detachment. That's kind of this undergirding theme of a 5 that we'll jump into. So their virtue is non-attachment. And I know I just said the word detachment as a negative. This has been reframed because detachment, obviously, it tends to have a negative connotation. Detached means to cut off. It's like, see you later. This virtue is actually great. They offer non-attachment, which means they're able to detach healthily from their emotions, which is great in problem solving. It's great in organizational areas, in leading. You can kind of detach and think objectively. So where some of us might get clouded by our feeling or sensing ourselves, a 5 can have this gift of saying, I need to just be observant. And so this requires me to be here, not here. And so that, I think, is one of their best gifts, honestly, is to think objectively, uncluttered by their emotions. That's such a gift. Now, their vice is the word avarice, which is weird. A lot of people are like, what does that word even mean? It translates as like greed or stinginess. I think avarice, the reason why they often use that word is because greed, a lot of times people think of material goods, which it can be. So some 5s literally can hoard their money in material goods. They can be cheap, I guess would be the word for some 5s, like I'm going to budget, I'm going to do this. But more often than not, this word avarice or greed is misunderstood. And it really is in the form of withholding emotions, time, energy, or in other cases, almost like this hoarding, this stockpiling information, ideas, facts. And really, the core desire of a 5 is to be capable, to be confident or competent is really the word here, and self-reliant. See, 5s fear more than anything that they'll be helpless, which honestly, as the total opposite of a 5, is exactly what a 2 feels as well. We don't want to be helpless. So it's the other interesting thing to start paying attention to the Enneagram is a lot of times some of our core things are very, very similar. It's how we react that starts to change completely. So they don't want to be helpless, useless, incapable. They want to be intelligent, informed, and knowledgeable. And if anything, if they could appear that way, to kind of have that intellect together and the knowledge, that's how they would prefer to be. This is probably the result of their childhood wound. And I know there's nature versus nurture. We kind of talked about this a little bit, but I tend to be the type that likes to dive in deep. Maybe I am a 4. I doubt I am, though. For 5s, the motivation for their greed is to hold on to what they have, and it's due to early experiences of either feeling neglected, so sometimes not getting enough from others, or in some cases being too engulfed in others. So if you're 5, I apologize, but you may have had an overbearing type 2 mother. It's very true, and I'm sorry if that's the case. It's true. So you either were detached and didn't get what you needed, so you learned to retreat and take care of in your mind. Or you were engulfed and suppressed and felt like, whoa, we don't have any boundaries. I need to create boundaries, and I will do that internally. And this can often happen, and I said on behalf of 2s everywhere, may I suggest some really great counseling. 5s couldn't change their circumstances. So what they learn to do as a coping mechanism is retreating into their mind. And so they hold on to their own resources. That's where the stingy greediness gets. They kind of get into, I'll protect me and mine. I can't change anything else, but I can change for me and mine. So they developed what kind of is interpreted more as like a poverty or scarcity mindset, which really is a way to unconsciously, a lot of times they might not even know they're doing it, but it's like this subconscious way to reduce their needs, to conserve their energy, to conserve their resources, and to turn inward. Because of this, 5s may appear emotionally distant, as if you can visibly see a wall come down when you're talking about feeling issues. And last week, we talked about how 2s need to learn the art of setting boundaries. 9s probably need to as well. 5s, on the other hand, probably have so many boundaries. It's ridiculous. Matter of fact, there's a subtype of the 5 called the castle, which is funny because you probably literally need a moat and a drawbridge to get to them. It's like walls up, and they have no problem doing that. which again, I think can be a blessing and a curse. It could be something the rest of us could learn from, how to set healthy boundaries. But on the other hand, it could be for a 5, I need to learn how to maybe let people in. 5s are often the most misunderstood type of the Enneagram, probably along with a 4. And I think it's because how they're viewed. They're often viewed as cold and unemotional. And I think most people think they don't have emotions, and that's not true. Everybody thinks, everybody feels, and everybody's present in their body. We all hold all of these things. It's just they're delayed emotional processors. They need to think things over before they feel them. Where a lot of us might intentionally just jump in, a 5 really needs to think it through. And sometimes spontaneity with their feelings can actually make them feel a bit out of control. It might even make them feel embarrassed. So it's something that it's like, I need to sit with my thoughts for a minute. And so 5s isolate feeling from knowing. They would rather intellectualize and talk about feelings sometimes than actually feel them. Like, let's just talk about how this feels, but I'm not really going to feel it. And this, honestly, is kind of similar to Enneagram 3s. So for all of you 3s out there, you might do the same thing. A little bit of, I might talk about it, but I'm not going to actually engage and accept what I'm feeling. So this pursuit for knowledge that the 5 has, it's not unique to the 5, although it's one of their core gifts. We see it everywhere. We see that mankind has been doing this really since the end of time, pursuing knowledge and knowing and meaning. We see it manifest itself in space exploration and rocket missions and science and research and philosophy and numbers. Gosh, if I had time, I would have liked to have put a whole bunch of like spreadsheets and data on my slides to make it even more 5-like. But we see it everywhere. We even see it, even though it seems like a stretch, we see it poured out onto the pages of the wisdom literature in the scriptures. Everywhere, this seeking for wisdom. We see it in the character of Luke. We see it in Joseph, who had this really unusual gift of wisdom. And yet we even see this in the incessant need to know in the story of Thomas, the apostle, better known as Doubting Thomas. And he, in my opinion, might have been the original deconstructionist. He was like, I don't know, let's think about this. I'm not sure. Because he's endlessly seeking answers. And so if we turn to the slide that says John chapter 20, verses 24 through 29, we can read a story here about Thomas encountering Jesus after the resurrection. It says, now Thomas, also known as Didymus, side note, I think we should do something on Thomas because that name means twin. There's a lot of really interesting stories there. But whenever you see something that's kind of like a side note, you're like, oh, that side note's probably important. Otherwise, why even mention it, right? You just leave the detail out. So he's one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, we have seen the Lord. And he said to them, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and believe and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. And so you right straight out of the gate get this idea that he's like, I'll believe it when I see it. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here, see my hands? And reach out your hand and put it to my side. Stop doubting and believe. Thomas said to him, my Lord, my God. You could see it was this revelation being revealed to him. Then Jesus told him, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. So here we see that Thomas was this skeptic that refused to believe without direct personal experience and demanded proof. Honestly, I think a lot of us can really empathize with this story. A lot of this. I think a lot of us have this part of this type 5 nature in us, this skeptic of, I need facts, proof, and certainty. And a 5 would be like, I want spreadsheets to back it up. Give me this example. Thomas is led by his intellect, and Jesus is calling him to be led by mystery. And that's challenging. Jesus is calling him to say, come into this unknown with me. Experience something that can't be measured. It can't be measured by data, facts, proof, or knowledge. And this is true wisdom, a knowing without knowing. And that's different. Wisdom and knowledge are different. We heard the old adage, what is it? Knowledge is knowing tomatoes are fruit, and wisdom is knowing not to put it in your tomato or in your fruit salad. I said that once to somebody, and they're like, I actually do that in my fruit salad. I was like, gross. Although I don't like fruit salad. But anyway, so we see this. Moving along. We see this, that it's hard. It's Jesus is saying, let's put away this believing and this doubting and this knowing for a minute and engage the heart. I know this is going to resonate with more than just fives, because I think a lot of us are struggling with this, even in this moment. So fives, when moving in their direction of disintegration or stress, detached fives suddenly become hyperactive, clingy, and scattered like unhealthy sevens, which is really very unusual for a five to be clinging and hyperactive, and they usually want the opposite of that. However, when moving in their direction of integration or growth, fives become more like self-confident, spontaneous, and decisive, like healthy eights, which is where I move to in unhealth. So if we're ever acting the same, we know somebody's got a problem and you're doing good. Fives grow by learning how to transform their fear and impulses to draw inward by sharing more of themselves and learning to trust the world outside of themselves. And that's a challenge for a five, to know that they can trust. It doesn't mean you have to trust every human in the planet, but I think it's like starting small, extending your boundaries just a little bit more. So some tips for fives. One, I would think notice your intentions. Notice when you're trying to impress other people with your knowledge. It's kind of like a go-to. We all have the thing that we do. We all have the thing we do, and this is for a five. Also, dive into conversations, and this can be tough. Now, it depends. There's some fives that are a lot more introverted than others. Some are a lot more willing to take charge and jump into convos. Did I make a mistake? Is it a very big one? Oh, twos. Tips for myself. Embrace my feelings. Got it. Embrace self-care. I do need to do that. Yep. My wife's giving me this look like, you messed up. Thank you. Thank you. Because even though I'm not a one wing, I still have this strong inner critic, and later I'm going to be like, oh, I messed up that slide. Fives, not twos. Please, fives, notice your intentions. Dive into conversations. Even if you're unsure of yourself, and it can be scary, jump into the conversation with others rather than withdraw. Because chances are you probably have some really wonderful insight to offer. The rest of us have been spouting off. We need a different perspective. Embrace self-care. Because fives tend to go inward and tend to almost get this greed or scarcity mindset, sometimes they can neglect themselves. And they won't take good care of themselves. They can be workaholics and not remember, I need to eat lunch. I need to take a break. Get outside in nature. A lot of fives say nature is so helpful for them to have rest. And embrace feelings, which is difficult. But try accessing your feelings, maybe in a different way. That doesn't mean you just have to sit down and be like, I'm going to feel something. Try it in a different way, maybe a way that engages the mind, like writing or poetry. Something that gets you to think and write it out. And then that way it's this processing. What fives do well, and fives do a lot of things well. One, they're perceptive. I had to double check that said fives. I'm being skeptical. Fives offer objective insight based on their observations of situations and information. Fives are great at this. Fives are the ultimate observer. They see things that a lot of us miss because we're too busy doing something else. And a lot of times a five will be likened to, as being an owl. And that's a really great, an old wise owl. And what do owls do? They just sit there, they're perched and they watch, and they watch, and they watch. And that's how they gain so much knowledge. They're curious. The interests and intellects of the five enable them to explore and build expertise in a variety of fields, topics, and theories. A lot of times fives will have these really niche things they're interested in. You'll talk to them and it's not just studying something, it's studying something, and then that's something, and then that's something, and they're down a bunny trail over here. They're pragmatic. Fives approach life in an unsentimental way. and they can put emotions aside when needed. They're really great problem solvers. So if something gets someone stressful, you might need to call a 5 and say, I need some help, because they're good at coming in and analyzing and seeing things and putting emotions aside. They're self-sufficient. The independent 5 will protect their autonomy and privacy. They prefer to ask little of others and are able to minimize their own needs. So they might appear to be the least needy of the bunch, but they shouldn't forget they have needs. They're inventive. 5's depth of knowledge and ideas enable them to be inventive and pioneering visionaries. We mentioned that before, but there's a lot that can come out of the mind of a 5. I like this. In The Road Back to You, Ian Cron says on page 172, he says, not all 5s are smart, but they're all observant. I know some of you 5s are going, how dare she say we're not all smart? I didn't say it, he said it. But they're all observant. You might glimpse them at a party observing the crowd from the periphery, or circling a social event like an anthropologist performing work in the field, collecting and analyzing information on people and the general going-ons. This tendency to observe is not passive, however, far from it. 5s are actively watching, taking in information, and filing it away for future use. So you can count on a 5 to be engaged, to watch, to see what's happening. Because 5s tend to withhold and observe, they make wonderful advisors. Wonderful advisors, they offer neutral input and logical perspectives, which is really helpful for most of us. So let's close with the spirituality part of the 5. The spiritual practice for a 5, ultimately, I think we're starting to see some patterns with a lot of us, that it requires a lot of solitude or silence or contemplative prayer. But silence brings clarity to the overactive 5 mind. And when you meet a 5, I've noticed a lot of them say that it's like a hamster wheel they can't get to stop. They have so many thoughts they're processing. And so silence is a way for them to be silent and sit with themselves. When 5s give themselves permission to detach from mental activity, then that's when they're kind of able to connect with the divine and with themselves. But silence honestly might seem excruciating for a 5, because you mean I have to sit here even more with my own thoughts? But stepping into this practice isn't just, I'm going to sit here, it's intentional. It's choosing a space for you to allow the divine interruption into your thoughts. You're welcoming the divine. I welcome you to interrupt my thought pattern right now and embrace the mystery of all that God is. So knowing I might not have all this figured out, I might not have all the answers, but I'm just going to step aside and embrace this mystery. And it's a place for you also, because you don't do this often, to take a moment to connect with your whole body, your whole self. How am I feeling in this moment? Have I neglected my body? Do I need to go get a massage? Take a moment with yourself and go, I need some self-care. And so questions for a 5 that I would like to leave you with, for you to ask yourself is, can I trust that I will receive what I need? Am I compartmentalizing my feelings? And how do I minimize my wants and desires? And lastly, I think a mantra for a 5 is for them to say to themselves, I rest in knowing that I have enough. And we could say that enough is whatever that means to you. For you, that might mean money, things, knowledge. You have enough, and you are enough. During this time, I'd like to ask the worship team if they would come up, and Aaron's going to lead us in a prayer for the type 5. To really close that out. And if you're a type 5, I encourage you to sit with this and maybe try not to get so lost in the thinking of it, but in letting it sit in your body and in your heart.
I want to invite you to go ahead and stand with me. God, awaken in me my full knowing, that I may remember my heart's desire. Give me eyes to see the many ways that life is abundant, the many blessings offered me each day, that I may receive my heart's desire. Empty me now of my need for predictability that can stifle my spontaneity. Empty me now of my stinginess that may withhold my gifts and love from others. Give me the wisdom to know when to think and when to act. calm my fears of rejection, and instill in me the courage to open my heart and share myself with others in ways that cultivate compassion. As I come to my full senses, I offer gratitude for my body's wisdom. May I begin each day grounded in that wisdom and in my presence, knowing that I have enough time, every information, and passion to live fully engaged in life.